Things were changing pretty fast in the early 2000s, especially in the camera industry. Pretty much every major player was trying to pull photographers away from film as hard as possible, with promises of things that are faster, being able to store more photos on a memory card, being able to do miraculous things editing in the computer, especially with, say, raw capture. And just ease of use in general compared to film. No more exposure to harsh chemicals in a dark room, no more converting your bathroom into an otherwise useless room in the house. So companies started making it a point to make these really durable, feature-rich cameras that had everything the film cameras had and more, so to try and woo these said photographers away. Because for a while, digital photography had been seen as kind of a family money saver kind of thing, looking back into the 90s, and a kind of experimental thing. But in the early 2000s, we really started seeing that boom of different manufacturers trying new things, making better and better sensors year over year over year, and Sony is no exception to that. This is the Sony S85. It is a, I want to say, professionally geared toward compact camera. I mean, at the time it was a very compact camera. Nowadays it's a kind of chunky boy, but it wasn't nowadays. This was 2001, before 9/11. Yet it can still give pretty pleasing results. I don't know if I say that by today's standards, but in general, especially if you're used to this sort of thing, or if you're exploring old cameras, as I have been doing for the past several years, going to thrift stores, which is where I found this one for $10. Would I pay more than $10 for this? Sure, I'd pay max $25, $30 for this. And there are a couple of reasons why. There are reasons that we'll go over at the table, where we'll get a closer look at the entire thing. Alrighty, welcome to my table. Now, let's see how viable this camera is now, and let's just take a look at it in general. So my DSC-85, I'm going to unmodify it real quick so you can see it in all of its normal glory. Let's take off the little strappy thing, and yeah, so this is the Sony DSC-S85 circa 2001. Now let's get to the battery first. The battery is an NP FM50. The FM50 they've been using for a really long time. It's a very high capacity battery. It was used in Sony's DSLRs, it was used in their SLTs. You can still buy these new, and unfortunately, unlike a lot of newer cameras, the Sony S85 actually checks to make sure this is an info lithium battery, meaning that if you get a generic battery, it's going to tell you that it's a generic battery and it's going to shut itself off. Now, a lot of people argue this is a protection thing, so it protects the device from a bad battery, but honestly, this is just a DRM thing to make you buy something that's really expensive, which these batteries are going to run between $60 to $100 nowadays for an actual Sony one. If you come from a mount, this is something you probably have laying around, which is kind of a bonus for this camera, it being a DSLR battery. So if you're a collector like me, it's nice that we have one battery that works for a lot of different things. So good job, Sony. Now, less of a good job is memory stick. So if you remember memory stick, it is Sony's proprietary standard. I've got a 32 megabyte here. Looks like a stick of gum, kind of reminiscent of the old batteries that their cassette players and CD players used for a while, the rechargeable ones. But the Sony memory stick, nobody liked because it was really expensive proprietary memory. You could get up to 128 megs for the original memory stick. Then the memory stick Pro came out. Now the Pro, I've tested, it does not work on this camera. You could get up to, I think, a gigabyte, maybe 2 gigs. I'd have to verify that online. I'll put something up on the screen to verify that. Most of them were this purple color, but you could get it from other manufacturers. Like I have a Lexar one too. So, and Sony doesn't check to see if it's a Sony memory stick. You can use a memory stick from any other manufacturer, which is cool. So let's look at the camera itself real quick. We're going to start on the bottom. So the bottom of the camera is not that exciting. You have a tripod mount. Now, if you put your finger on there, it kind of feels like it's plastic, but it's not. It is actually metal, which is very good. You have your battery / memory card door, which opens in a very satisfying way, but it's not the most durable mechanism in the world. So, yeah, it takes your battery there, your memory stick there. It's a single memory stick, as to be expected. And that's about it for the bottom. It does sit flat too, so if you need to sit it on a surface, it's got these little feet. So going to this side, because this is the less exciting side, there's nothing over here other than this really nice strap lug that's not going anywhere. It twists. It's actually built into the camera itself. Now the front of the camera is magnesium, and the back of the camera is plastic, presumably ABS. So it's still very durable, scratch resistant. This copy, I mean, being as old as it is, it looks great. Going over to the other side, you have something I'm going to talk about in a minute, this ACC port. It's something we don't like to see, and it's a Sony-ism, as I say, a Sony-ism. One of the kind of bad proprietary things that Sony did to shoot itself in the foot a few times. Underneath this very satisfying door, wow, that feels good to open and close. You got a couple things, and these are products of their time. You've got a mini USB-B port here that you can plug in the computer to read the memory card from the camera. Not the best way to do it, because it's like the slowest way to do it. And then you have your AV out. So this goes to a breakout cable that will give you your left and right stereo and your video, which is yellow. Then you have here, which is your speaker for when you play a video on here, because this does record video. It records video in MPEG Movie EX format, or MPEG Movie format. It just records in MPEG. Okay, that's the easy way to put it. It's like 320p or something. Yeah, going to the top of the camera now, we're going to look at that. This is a cold shoe, and this leads into that accessory port that I was talking about. So if you want a flash on this camera, instead of them just putting a hot shoe in here and calling it a day, there's one flash that works. Just one flash. And it was sold specifically for this, and it has a little port that plugs into here to trigger it. Now, I'm wondering if I could reverse engineer this, so that way it will instead take like an off-camera flash or a flash remote that plugs in with a 3.5 millimeter jack. This doesn't look like 3.5 mil. This actually looks like the smaller one. I'd have to build out a cable for it to see if I can get it to work, but I'm going to hope and assume that it is simple enough to be able to do that, and then you would be able to do a remote flash, which would be really cool. Otherwise, you can still trigger a remote flash using the onboard flash, which is fine too, and the onboard flash is pretty decently powerful. Moving on though, you have your microphone up here. Let's see, you have a dial here that is very reminiscent of a DSLR at the time. So it has a very satisfying click. It feels really good to turn, and it has all of your basic options. You've got your P mode is taken by the automatic mode here, but you still have your shutter, aperture, manual. Then you have a scene mode, and one of the things that cameras from this time often had was a setup mode. So instead of pressing a menu button on the back of the camera, you would go into a dedicated setup mode to change things like image resolution or file type or the clock and things like that. Do I like it that way, or do I like it the way it is now? I like it the way it is now, but that's just how it was back then. Then you had your movie mode, so you could record those kind of movies. Playback mode, so you could watch the video and you could look at your photos. And then it goes back to automatic mode, which is honestly where this camera usually was for most people. But your power switch is over here, so it's not super hard to accidentally trigger the power, because you got to go all the way up. And if you're turning this, the power switch does not move at all, which is nice. They're not linked at all. They're just on the same ring. The shutter actually feels pretty good for what it is. It is a little spongy, but it's firm, so you don't accidentally press it. And the second stage detent is very obvious, which is nice. So you can definitely feel where the detent is and then take the shot for focusing and then shooting. Now this does autofocus and manual focus, but we're going to talk a little bit more about the manual focus when we look at the back. So the front of the camera, it shows the lens, which is a Carl Zeiss lens. This is the same lens that they've been using in the past 2 iterations of this camera. It is an f2 to 2.4, and it is 7 to 21 millimeters. So you're getting something like so it's a 34 to 102 millimeter equivalent. So you get about f2 at that 35 millimeter mark, all the way to 85 millimeters, which you'll have about f2.3. And then at that 102 millimeter, you will be at f2.5. I misspoke earlier. It is f2 to 2.5. So f2.5 at 102 millimeters is still pretty nice. We will look at the lens's performance when we actually look at photos from the camera. So yeah, we'll see if it's held up. Also, looking at the front, you have your front-mounted flash, which is just a flash. Also in the front, you see the viewport for the OVF, or the optical viewfinder. This actually does zoom in and out along with the lens, but due to parallax, it is pretty useless, just as most of these were. I kind of understand why they kept these things around for so long, is because people were still coming from compact film cameras and they were still used to looking through the little port rather than looking at the screen on the back to see what the camera was actually seeing. So I guess it kind of makes sense. Does it make sense that they put in that much money into it? Not really. I would have liked to have seen them omit that and put a better display on the back, but I don't know if that better display even existed back then. Now looking at the back of the camera, you can see that big, small screen in all of its glory. You see that the port here, the viewport for the OVF, has a diopter correction, so they put a lot into making this OVF work. And you have a separate screen that gives you your exposure. Now this again is harkening back to film photographers who are used to having this little screen to show what their exposure was, especially coming from SLRs. Here you have your zoom rocker, so wide to tele. Let me put a battery in it and turn it on real fast. And a memory card. Before we look more at the back of the camera, let's turn it on. I do like the little noise it makes on startup. I don't know if you heard it, but it does make a little Sony sound. All right, so now that it's on, you can see the grainy little display. And you have your little LCD screen right there. Let's see if we can get into that. Yeah, so you can see it here. It shows all your information that you need to know. It shows that it's currently in macro mode, so I'm kind of impressed that it kept that information even though I had the battery out for a while, meaning that the internal battery here that saves your clock information and your previous settings is still going, which is really surprising considering this camera's age. I mean, this camera would be older than my kids if I had them at a young age. You have your typical buttons here, so you have your little D-pad here that allows you to select your other settings, like your flower tulip mode, which is your macro, your timer, and your flash, and whatever this is that I keep pressing, which I think is a back button. And it does actually depress in the center too. Your menu here does, now this menu is actually kind of nice because it gives you your most used features like your white balance, your ISO, so you can put that between 100 and 400, which is typical of these older cameras using CCD sensors. Your image size you could change. Now this used to be super important back in the day because a lot of people were using cameras like this for email and blogging. So for emails, you wanted that picture to be pretty small. So if you're just sending grandma a picture of your cat, put it on 640 by 480 and she'll see it pretty big on her screen. As far as picture quality goes, fine and standard. If you are using that 8 megabyte card that the camera came with, you put it in standard mode to get a few more shots on there. This is again something that a family photographer would be more interested in. And then you have some other kind of interesting stuff that's also products of its time. Burst 3 gives you a burst mode for fast things, so you have a better chance of actually catching it. Your exposure bracketing is if you want to, well, exposure bracket, same thing it's always been. Email mode is going to make the picture real tiny and make it easy to email, because email in the late 90s, early 2000s, it was very limited on space. So you could only get really small images in an email. Voice, it records your voice. That's one of those things I don't really know why you need to do that on a camera. Text. This is going to shoot in a super, super high contrast black and white. This is actually a mode that I really like on these old cameras because you can use it in creative ways to get interesting images. So you're going to get, it's going to show black and white on here, but if I actually take the image, and when it takes forever to record. So when you shoot in one of these special modes, it is both shooting the full color JPEG at whatever size you specify, and it's shooting that extra special variant of it. So in this case, it's also making that text file. So what I think it's doing is it's taking that JPEG and then it's processing it in camera, which is very, very slow, because processing in camera at this time, a lot of these cameras, they used FPGAs. They weren't very fast. I mean, the technology just wasn't there yet. So if we go to view, let's see what that text thing actually looks like, if you can see it on the little screen. And it's going to load. It's going to load a little bit. Okay, it's retracting the lens because it needs to protect the lens while you're looking at your images, which are taking forever to display. Oh boy. Hey, there it is. Okay, so yeah, as you can probably see here, the text mode gives you a super high contrast image. So you are getting black, you are getting white, and you're getting nothing in between, which is kind of cool. Let's go back to regular mode. Oh, you also get TIFF. So TIFF is, if you don't know, is an uncompressed file format. The files are absolutely massive in size. And like I said before in the intro, this is what you would expect to get out of a scanner. So if you were scanning a film negative, then you would get a TIFF file and you'd work on that, just like a kind of like a raw file, and then you would go to the lower quality JPEG from there. Now, shooting TIFF on this camera is highly, highly impractical just because the memory cards are not that big and the processing is painfully slow. In a studio environment, maybe, but for like still life, sure, that's an option. But if you're doing that kind of stuff in a studio, you probably have a more appropriate camera. So let's go down here to normal. Then we get your flash level you can adjust. Then you've got some other stuff, so your sepia, black and white. So if you want a regular black and white image, you got that here. Solarize, you know, just stuff from the time period. Negative, art, okay. And then off. And then your sharpness adjustment, which I like to just leave at 0 because I don't know what the sharpness artifacts would look like from this thing, and we're not going to go that in depth. So yeah, as far as buttons go, you got your typical other stuff. So you can control your exposure compensation, you can control your spot metered, or if it is a little wider area, focus. Focus, you can use the little dial up here to manually focus. It tells you the distance in meters, which for a lot of Americans doesn't help. And you can tell kind of when something is in focus on the screen, but that is one of the big downfalls of these older cameras with these low resolution screens, is it is really kind of hard to tell. It's kind of hard to get critical focus, especially when you're shooting in macro. So you have to take multiple shots at different focus levels to see which one's the closest. Also, especially when shooting macro, it is not the most granular focus thing. It's not like on a DSLR or mirrorless camera where you have a ring and you manually turn it, whether it's focused by wire or mechanical focus. Like, that's super, super precise and you can really dial it in. With this, you don't really have that option. I think manual focusing on this was a little bit of an afterthought and a little bit of a limitation of its design. So moving on from there, yeah, you have your AE lock, whatever. And then you have a DC input. This is kind of cool because now you can plug the camera into the wall and just use it like that instead of using the battery. But yeah, that's about it for the back, other than the little jog dial that you can use to adjust your exposure settings in manual mode or in one of the other modes. You can also use that to do various other things like that, like I said, your focusing, etc. So yeah, that's a tour of the back. I don't know if I can get this thing to look through the viewfinder. Yeah, it's real tiny, But the little party trick is that it, come on, yeah, it does zoom in, but the parallax is so far off that it's just not that useful. So that's the tour of the back of the camera. That's the tour of all the sides, and yeah, so you've pretty much got a good idea of what you're looking at. I will say about the ergonomics, since it's so chunky, it's pretty easy to hold. The grip on the front is really comfortable, and it is kind of rubbery, but my particular copy, it still feels good. It's not turning into a liquid, and it's not getting all over my hands, which is very nice, and it is a testament to the quality of the device. This is a very high quality camera. It's going to meet the expectations of photographers who are used to both cheesy plastic film cameras and professional level cameras alike. So good job on that, Sony. They got the memo. Granted, they had several iterations before it to perfect it, and I think they've done about as much as they can with what they had. Especially reusing the same design. Basically change the color, make it look a little better than the old silver version, and curiously enough, this thing's successor would go back to silver, or its supposed spiritual successor. But that's actually a camera that we'll look at later on. For now, let's look at how this thing looks on different displays. Because I think for its usefulness nowadays, a lot of people are going to put an image from this, a 4 megapixel image, up on a 4K display and be like, wow, that's completely useless. But then if you take it into the context of what was available at the time, I think that paints a much better picture for it. So let's do that. First, we'll look at an image from the S85 on a 4K display. Here we will see that the image does not cover the whole display, as it is only about half the resolution of the monitor. While it doesn't look tiny, it is still only about the size of an 8x10 on my 27-inch display. I think this would turn a lot of people off from these older cameras. They see this and instantly think it isn't enough. But what if I told you it's just an illusion? Here we see the image on a 1440p display. I use this one for non-color critical work, gaming, and general use, since elements like text display larger. My eyesight's not that great outside of the macro range, so this lower resolution display has been a big quality of life improvement for me, since I don't have to adjust scaling when doing different things. I will say though that Windows 11, which I just upgraded to about 2 weeks ago, handles automatic scaling far better than 10, but I digress. This is also more indicative of what most people are going to see, since most laptops are still rocking something around 1080p, upwards of 1440p, as are most AIOs or all-in-one computers and monitors. Phone displays are going to upscale things, and most of those are in the 720p to 1080p range. And honestly, this is just fine. We get the image scaled to 78% to cover the vertical resolution of the display. It is nice and big and still looks good. Granted, you can see the flaws in the image a little better, but that's fine. If we go to 100%, you can tell that it overlaps. And there it is, a big image, 4.1 megapixels, looks huge. So this is the kind of computer that Sony was more expecting their camera customers to be using. This particular VAIO laptop is from around 2002. This is the PCG-FXA47, which is just a typical Sony name for a product. It runs Windows XP out of the box. This one's actually been restored to factory condition as far as the Windows XP installation goes. It does recognize my trackball mouse right away, and it does actually recognize my almost period correct card reader pretty much right away. The card reader is actually probably from around 2006 or 8, somewhere in there. But it does read the memory stick just fine. So we're able to pull up the image on a monitor that is more typical of the era. Now, the resolution of the screen and screens, laptop screens in general back then, this particular one is set at 1024 by 768 and had actually been very typical for square monitors back into the 90s. So back in this day you had, oh, and it does have a floppy drive, by the way. Floppy drive, DVD drive, has a little bit of everything. You had to play which one is it, because it doesn't show which one has a card in it. I know that it's the I. So if we make a folder here, we'll call it S85, and I will say that this keyboard is kind of a joy to type on, and Windows XP is not fun to use. no window snapping, which is something I am very used to. Actually, let's just take all of it so I can... We're going to do a move task, so that way it doesn't leave anything on the memory card, so it's fresh and ready to go. Alright, all the files are transferred over. So now we have all of our files. We can view them in the Windows XP editor. Oh, if you want to see what the text mode does, it is literally black, white, no dithering. So you get something that looks kind of like this. But looking at a file on this screen, if you were to put it at 100%, now this is a screen that's much more typical of what somebody from this era would have had. It takes up a lot. Oop. Nope, let's go back to 100. There we go. So it's actually huge for the time. I mean, this is what would be considered a massive image at 4.1 megapixels. And the detail is great for the time as well. I mean, you can see the characteristic early CCD sensor softness and kind of grossness in the background over here. And you do see some of the limitations of the lens where there's some chromatic aberrations that we don't really like. The noise, there's going to be noise even at base ISO just because that's how these CCD sensors are. But, you know, it's not bad. And the transition from the parts that are in focus to out of focus looks surprisingly good. This would have been shot at, well, let's find out. This is 17. So to see the metadata, we're going to go to Properties, Summary. Nope. Alright, well, you can't see the metadata on Windows XP like you can in newer versions of Windows, which kind of sucks. Let's see if there's a detail thing. There is not. So let's see if there's some kind of Sony proprietary photo viewer thing on here. Digital print. ArcSoft photo printer. We've got a lot of bloatware. Picture gear. Here we go. What does this do? Digital photo manager. Alright, so it's got a bunch of photos from just sample pictures. Here we go. So maybe this will give us our metadata. Yeah, so picture gear automatically adjusts it to 35%. Now this is proprietary Sony software, so this is something you will never see nowadays. And at 35%, the image actually looks fantastic. You don't see any of the weird anomalies. You don't see any of the grossness with the noise, the old gross CCD noise, which actually you kind of do in here, but it's not anywhere near as bad. I think if I saw this in 2001, I'd be pretty blown away. I would be very happy with this camera at the time because this is significantly better than its contemporaries. And this picture gear program is not bad either for what it is. How about the information? Yeah, so in the information here we have it was shot RGB, 72 DPI, 24-bit. The image size here. The information, here we go. So device information, Sony CyberShot at f2, 21 millimeters, so this was zoomed in. But for this photo, f2.8, shutter speed was 10/600, okay. ISO 100, flash did not fire. This Sony laptop works well with the Sony camera, and then I can get all of my metadata. I can also full screen the image, which is kind of cool. So yeah, that's Sony photo gear mini review. As far as bloatware goes, it's not the worst thing in the world. I would have actually used it back then. In actual use, this camera seems to do okay. It gets the job done. I found that I was often using it in macro mode. That seems to show off its strengths well, and it is just something I tend to do. As you can see, it does capture great detail. The lens is sharp and definitely appropriate for the sensor, despite being a reused part from older cameras. The little battle sister is a little bigger than a compact flash card, standing on end, and we see plenty of details. The lumbering tortoise is no different. You can see all the little seams from the plastic mold machine, and its face is slightly out of focus. It is very difficult to get the camera to focus on exactly what you want at these close distances because of the grainy display and the coarsely stepped manual focusing system. Arnold here decided to lay on the couch while my hot lights were going, so I took the opportunity for some wildlife photography. Focusing was understandably slow and unable to track him as he moved around. I did figure out that I could get him to look and pause by making a strange whistling noise, so he stayed still. Framing with the viewfinder is out of the question, so I had to rely on the rear display and hope it was focusing on his eyes instead of his nose. I think the camera was overall more interested in his ears. White balance was accurate, sharpness shows in the fur, overall good results. Outside my house there are some pink flowers to show what the camera can do at a mid-distance on auto exposure. Despite full sun, the auto exposure did an excellent job at keeping the highlights from blowing out. You still get some details in the shadow areas too. The strengths and weaknesses regarding color with the CCD sensor show through. The pinks and greens are vibrant, but the colors in the shadows look a bit muddy. Overall, I think these basic snapshots look pretty good. I also took the camera out on a little field trip with a friend to the coastline in Hercules, California. Most of the time I was using the SD9, but I got about a film roll's worth of snaps from the S85. Skies are usually a bit blown out, although the sun was not in the best position for this, and there wasn't really any cloud cover to speak of. I don't like how older cameras handle these conditions. Everything looks very muted. This could be fixed in post, but I don't think most people using this camera would be doing anything in post at all. Shots away from the sun look pretty nice. You get some blue in the skies, and the greens look pretty good. Some more close-up macro. We already know the camera does a pretty good job with that, but focusing with the wind was very tricky. The CCD and JPEG processing did an okay job at handling this fuchsia color, but it seems a little overdone. Let's get back to this photo of Arnold. I kind of like it, and he doesn't have a place on the wall yet. Let's stress it out a bit and do a big print. Normally, a 4.1 megapixel image is supposed to be printed at about an 8 by 10 or smaller. I think this is a little boring though, so we're going to go 18 by 12, an order of magnitude larger. I haven't used my printer in a bit, so I'm expecting some errors in the print, but this isn't turning out too bad. Near the end, we can see CCD artifacts, JPEG artifacts, and a slight semblance of pixelation, but stepping back to normal viewing distance, it doesn't look bad. If someone was just casually looking, I could see them thinking that it was shot with an SLR. I'm really satisfied with this print and encourage you to print or get your stuff printed. Even at low resolution, with a $10 camera, you can get something to be proud of. That about wraps up this long, meandering video. If you stuck around with me for this long, I really appreciate it. This was a bit more relaxed than I plan on being going forward. So with so much unscripted content and all that, next time we'll be looking at my beige whale that I recently acquired. And if you want to see more of the 2002-ish photo editing experience courtesy of Sony bloatware, I can show you some of that. Just let me know if you're interested. So yeah, thanks for watching, and see you next time.